ready to start, we're going to be on page 38. Page 38, Joshua's final challenge, which is a covenant renewal. And looking over the lesson, this is the last lesson in the book of Joshua. And then the section is entitled Joshua and Judges. There's actually, I think, 3 lessons involving the Judges in the book of Judges. I know one of them, we already kind of covered Deborah a few months back, and we're already a couple weeks behind, so probably next week we will skip ahead to the last lesson, just for a heads up, on page 64, which is on Samson, and then that will probably wrap up this section before we go into the next one in 2 weeks from tonight, Philippians and Colossians. So tonight on page 40, and then next week, if you want to jump ahead to study probably page 64 on Samson. And I think if we get to the end of the lesson that I have tonight, we're kind of going to mention Samson. And so that'll be a kind of a nice little segue into that next lesson. All right, Joshua's final challenge and covenant renewal, page 38. Call your attention to the shaded box, the central truth, the focus, and evangelism emphasis. And if we read it, it says, central truth, God is always faithful to his covenant. The focus is recognize God's covenant faithfulness to his people and respond by faithfully serving him. And then the evangelism emphasis, God calls individuals into covenant with him. Now, there's a word that's common to all 3 of those things. What word is that? Covenant. And so before we get any further tonight, and of course the lesson is entitled Covenant Renewal, which was Joshua's final challenge to the people of Israel. His kind of farewell address to them involved renewing the covenant. So just real quick, let's be reminded what the covenant is. The covenant is... If I was defining it, someone asked me, I would say it's a blood oath. It is, it's more than a pinky promise. It's more than just, I'll do that. But it involves blood. It is a blood covenant, a blood oath. And literally the word translate, the Hebrew word, if we're translating it into English, would look something like this, berith. Is the word in Hebrew. It's Strong's. If you're a Strong's Concordance fan, it's Strong's word 1285, and Junior has that on the screen, and you can see up there, berith, and what it means. It implies a covenant, a league, a treaty. It involves, you see at the bottom, the sense of cutting. And if you recall, the first covenant that we read about, this berith in Scripture, is in Genesis 15 when the covenant with Abraham. Something just interesting to note, and in the Hebrew, and pardon my Hebrew writing, but berith is something like this in modern Hebrew: Beth, Resh, Yod, and Tav. And if you look, Junior, switch to the Hebrew, the ancient Hebrew pictograph chart up there. So we went over this a couple Sundays ago. You've probably seen this, but remember, this is kind of the modern Hebrew script. So this, if you're in Israel today, this is kind of, aside from the poor handwriting, this is kind of what the modern letters look like. But the ancient letters, the original Hebrew letters, were more kind of like hieroglyphics. And so if you look at berith, covenant, it's spelled, the first letter is bet, which means house. It represented a house or a dwelling. The second letter is resh. Resh is down here, and it was kind of shaped like a head. At least that's what they say. And it meant head or first person. So resh, Beth Resh, and then Yod. Yod is up here, or no, where's it at? Right here. Yod means arm or hand, specifically hand, is predominant. And because it's hand, it also can represent work. What does your hand do? your hand works and does stuff. So it involves work. And then the last letter, Tav, originally looked like a cross in the original ancient Hebrew, and it meant mark, sign, or covenant. And so when you put it together, Beth, house, resh, head, first, primary, yod, hand, and then the tav, meaning the cross or the covenant. Berith means the head of the house, the first one of the house whose hand or work is performing the covenant. Or you could even say whose hand is on the cross. And that, obviously, the tav, the original representation, was cross. So Beth and Resh, the head of the house. Beth and Resh is actually, just by themselves, how you spell bar. And in Hebrew, bar means son. So covenant could also mean the son whose hand is on the cross. And that's what the covenant means, the word covenant. That's how you spell. That's why it's really cool to know. I have a chart like this printed out in my office, and anytime I look up a word in Hebrew, I also see how it's spelled, and I look up the original pictograph, because that's the reason the word means what it means, is, how did they get berith for covenant? Well, they put the symbols together, and it kind of painted a picture. That's literally what it was meant to do, was to paint. It basically gave you the definition of the word in the letters themselves and what they stood for. So a reminder, a covenant was made when you walked between pieces of sacrificed flesh. So they would offer, if I was going to make a covenant with you, we would take an animal, a lamb or a goat or a cattle. We would cut it into pieces, lay the pieces in like a path, and then we would pronounce our oath, what we were going to do, what we say we're going to do, and we would pronounce it as we were walking through the pieces, this pathway of the sacrifice. And in so doing, the analogy, what you're doing is you're saying, what happened to this animal, this sacrifice, I am making a blood oath. I'm giving you more than my word. I'm betting my life on, I'm staking my life on it, that what happened to this animal would happen to me if I don't keep my oath that I'm pronouncing. That was the symbology behind that. And so if you remember from Genesis 15, God told Abraham to get the sacrifice ready. He told them all the animals, multiple animals, cut them up, put them in the path. And then God shows up in Genesis 15 and makes a covenant with Abraham, but Abraham does not walk through the pieces. God walked through the pieces himself, by himself, and did not require Abraham to. Why? Because God knew Abraham could never keep the covenant. And so by God walking through the covenant, and remember, if you broke the covenant, what happened? What happened to this will happen to me. God pronounced the covenant with Abraham, knowing that the children of Israel and Abraham's offspring would not keep it. So since God was the only one to walk through the covenant, he was saying, even if you break the covenant, I will take the penalty. And that's what Christ did. What did Christ do? The head of the house, the son's hand, was already on the cross. He was already the work of the cross was already established from Jesus was the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. He was already keeping the covenant, doing the work required of the covenant to fulfill it, even before he even made the covenant. And he has been ever since. And that's how you spell the word covenant, is God saying, I will perform it. I will keep the covenant. And so kind of full circle there, right from the beginning of the spelling. So it's kind of cool when you understand. So that's what Joshua is renewing, the covenant. So golden text says, it's Joshua 24:14. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood, and in Egypt serve ye the Lord. Now, it's interesting, this term here, that your God served on the other side of the flood. On the other side of the flood, it's literally mean when the flood was over, the gods that they served. Well, where did they go? Where did mankind wind up? On the other side of the flood, after Noah's day, as his children spread out. The Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 9, or 11, where they wound up. They wound up in a place called Babel. And if you know the story, which was in Mesopotamia, when God is renewing the covenant, or Joshua was renewing the covenant with God and the children of Israel, he's telling them, the gods, put away the gods your fathers served on the other side of the flood. Now, no one within the sound of his voice had ever set foot in Mesopotamia or Babel. It had been 700 years since Abraham had been called out at this point, since they had first ventured into Babel. But Babel, or Nimrod, who was the first ruler, world ruler, dictator, however you want to call him after the flood, Babel and Nimrod's kingdom was the origin of all of the cult, pagan, idolatrous religions on earth. They all sprang from Babel, from Mesopotamia, from the area of Babylon. And this would include all of the Canaanite gods, Baal, Molech, Astarte, Ashtaroth, Dagon, Chemosh, all of the gods that you're going to hear about, that the children of Israel are going to be dealing with the Canaanites and their gods. All of these gods had their origins in Babel or Babel, and under Nimrod's rulership. And so the first thing Joshua is reminding them, to not only put away the gods of Egypt, which they were familiar with because them as children, or their parents obviously, at this point were the ones that had come out of Egypt, that had dealt with the gods of Egypt. And remember, they even made the golden calf, Hathor, when Moses was up on the mountain. So they were still dealing with the gods of Egypt. But Joshua goes to the root of the problem. And he says, put away the gods even from after the flood. And those were the gods of Babylon. And it's interesting because when we get to the book of Revelation, you remember in the book of Revelation there's something called Mystery Babylon. And so John is seeing in the last days there is a worldwide religion in the end times which was unknown. It was a mystery to most, that the origins of it was simply a continuation of what came out of Babylon. And so literally all of those ideologies, those false gods, those spirits that were causing God's people to fall into idolatry, those gods came out of Babylon, and they have continued through the gods of Egypt, through the gods of the Persians, through the gods of the Greeks, the Roman gods, and all the way through the false religions and false gods and cults of today. That thread has wound through all of history. And so when we get to the book of Revelation, John sees the woman riding the beast and said that her name was Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots. But what it was, it's a worldwide deceptive religious system that goes all the way back to Babylon. And it's interesting, I find it interesting here, I'd never really picked up on that before, that where he's renewing the covenant, and he says, don't just put away the current gods that you're aware of, but put away and reject the gods that go all the way back to the time after the flood that originated in Babylon. Why? Because that's really the root and the heart of all false religions that will carry on all the way until they're going on in our day. Not to burst any bubbles, but a lot of the rituals and the things that go on in Roman Catholicism, you would be surprised when you read about the religious systems of Babylon that they're actually reenacting and doing a lot of the same things. And so that thread, again, anything that is a false religion, anything that is cultic or pagan, has its roots in that era. And so Joshua is calling attention to that. All right, let's get into the introduction tonight, if that wasn't an introduction enough. And there's heads up, there's probably going to be a few rabbit trails we'll go on tonight, and just seemed like a lot of things jumped out at me that pertain to things going on today that I think is important to bring up. All right, Net, just read the first paragraph for right now of the introduction.
Last week, we considered Israel's treaty with the Gibeonites and the subsequent battles against the Amorite kings who attacked Gibeon. This week, we fast forward to the end of Joshua's life and his final instructions to the children of Israel. First, let's consider what happened between these two events. Joshua had led Israel through a series of strategic campaigns that resulted in the conquering of most of the land. By and large, Joshua had accomplished the conquest of Canaan. He then oversaw the appointment of the land to the various tribes of Israel. He was now an old man, ready to go to his rest in the Lord. But before he departed, one last task awaited him.
All right. Junior, put up that slide, the map. Hopefully it worked. Yeah, okay, perfect. Worked better than I thought. I was afraid it might be a little too big, so thanks for working some magic. So this is what the land of Canaan, Mediterranean Sea, the Dead Sea, the Jordan River up to the Sea of Galilee. So this is the purple area is what Joshua had conquered by the end of his life, where we're picking up here by Joshua chapter 23 and 24, as he's renewing the covenant. This is where we're at in the conquest that over the 21 years or so. And the purple is where the children of Israel have conquered. Now, you notice there's still a lot of green there. And you notice some of the preponderance of the green is right here. What's this area called? What's that? Gaza. We recognize that today, don't we? So isn't it interesting that among the areas that they did not conquer in the initial conquest was Gaza. And then if you notice how it kind of dips in here, right, I got to go up to see it a little better. Yeah, so right, I don't know if you can see it, right where the green dot is, when I move it, you'll see a red dot if you have good eyes. If you don't, it's there, trust me. There's a little red dot right there where it dips in here, and that is the city of Jebus, or would become known as Jerusalem. Now, again, it's kind of interesting that among the areas was the land of the Philistines, or the Gaza Strip, and Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting is these areas would remain unconquered until 300 and some odd years later, nearly 400 years later, when King David, the forerunner of the Messiah, would finally conquer Gaza and the land of the land of the Philistines, and the city of Jebus, which would be renamed Jerusalem. So David, the anointed one, the anointed king, would be the one who would finally conquer Jerusalem. He would make Jerusalem the capital of Israel, and then he would also conquer the Gaza Strip, or the land of the Philistines. And so I find that a little bit interesting, because just in recent times, Jerusalem has been officially declared the capital of Israel, and there's been a battle raging, which people say, oh, we finally got peace there. We'll see about that. But again, it's the same it's the same geographic area. Now, what is ironic, I should have had a map of this, but if you notice the shape here, right here, and it dips in where Jerusalem's at, and then it bulges out again. So Israel has these two areas here with a dip. If you look at a modern map of Israel, did you know the West Bank, which is the world saying should be part of a Palestinian state that should be given to the Palestinians, the West Bank takes on this exact same shape. So the irony is, this was the area that Israel conquered. This is the area that they lived in for hundreds of years before the whole country was subdued. If there's any territory in all of the land of Israel that could say, if any land's going to belong to the Jews, this is the land that has the longest history that should belong to the Jews unequivocally, it's the West Bank. And it follows this exact same pattern, except today they say, no, this is the area that is set aside. It's not called Judea and Samaria, it's the West Bank, and it should be set aside for the Palestinians to make that their homeland. When, in fact, that's the land that has the most ancient ties, is the longest held by the Jews. So it's kind of a bizarre situation, isn't it? Reminds me of Ezekiel 35 or 36, where the enemies of God, God's people, are boasting that even the ancient high places, the ancient holy sites of Israel belong to us. And of course, those Palestinians living in the West Bank are saying these ancient lands that have the ruins of the Jews and all of Israel on them, they belong to us, and they're claiming them for themselves. And God doesn't take too kindly for that. So keep an eye on that. In the coming days, when they are trying to make peace between the Jews and the Palestinians, and what land the world says that Israel should give over to the Palestinians, just remember that the West Bank belonged to the Jews longer than any other land in the whole country, and that's some of the land they want to give up. Okay, paragraph 2, or we'll never get halfway through this lesson tonight.
Several decades had gone by since Israel entered the Promised Land. As they had renewed their covenant with God before entering Canaan, it was fitting to affirm their commitment to the covenant now at the end of the military campaigns. So Joshua had one final act as the leader of Israel, to remind the people of God's historical faithfulness and challenge them to remain faithful to God in the future. The book of Joshua ends on this high note, a renewal of God's covenant with his people.
All right. Renewal. Now, what's another way you could say a renewal? A renewal of the covenant. Could you say that as a confirmation of the covenant? A confirming of the covenant? I think you could. That wouldn't be a stretch. So the covenant, and what covenant? The covenant between God and his people, but specifically to who? Who did God make the covenant with? What's that? Abraham. It was God who told Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. I'm giving you this land. Your offspring will be as the stars of the heaven, the sand of the sea. God made that covenant with Abraham. Abraham was the one who set the pieces of the sacrifice that God walked through, and God confirmed that covenant with Abraham. And now Joshua is here at the end of his life, and he is wanting to renew the covenant, confirm the covenant, remind Israel of this covenant that God made with Abraham, and thus, because they're the children of Abraham, to them. And he's saying, before we enter in, to paraphrase what his thought process, before we enter into this age of peace and inheritance, before they settle down in the land, the promised land, before we enter into this age of peace and inheritance, let's be reminded of the blood oath that God gave Abraham. Now, here's another rabbit trail. But again, it's like if you're not going to talk about how the Bible involves what's going on today, you may as well not even talk about it, because the Bible is for today. What's going on is relevant. So isn't it interesting that the current Mideast peace process is celebrating or pushing what is called the Abraham what? The Abraham Accords. What is an accord? It is a treaty, it is an agreement, or you could say it is a covenant. So here we are thousands of years later, and what's in the news in the Middle East? We're going to bring peace before we enter into the age of peace in the Middle East, we need to promote, we need to sponsor, we need to be reminded of the Abraham Accords or the Abraham Covenant. Now, why is that significant other than just the fact that it's mentioning a biblical man named Abraham? Is in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Junior, throw that up there. In Daniel 9:27, this is one of the most important passages in all of Bible prophecy, because it says, and he, you have to read earlier for context, the he is the prince that shall come, otherwise known as the Antichrist. He will confirm, he will renew, he will remind the covenant with many for 1 week. That word week is Shabuah in Hebrew, and it means a week of years. Week, don't think of week is only 7 days. In Hebrew, a week is a grouping of 7. And so in this context, it was a group of 7 years. So when we talk about the end times and the tribulation period being a 7-year period, this is one of the main verses that we have that understanding that the Antichrist is going to come and confirm the covenant with many nations for 7 years. And in the middle of the 7 years, he will cause the sacrifice and the offerings to cease. Now, where were the sacrifice and offerings taking place? In the temple. So this lets us know there has to be, at some point in the near future, a temple rebuilt in Jerusalem for this to take place. Jesus also alludes to this. Book of Revelation also alludes to this, that there will be a temple standing in Jerusalem for the Antichrist to come in the middle of the 7 years and defile. And so, but I want to focus again on that first few lines. And he shall confirm, he will renew. What's the title of our lesson tonight? Joshua is saying he wants to renew, remind, reinforce the covenant with many. Now, most have assumed, when they read this in the past, they assumed that the covenant would be a random peace treaty. That in the context that the Antichrist is going to come to power, and once Israel came back as a nation and we could kind of see how things were working, we're like, aha, the Antichrist will come to power in ruling over the world and enter the world consciousness or onto the world scene and identify himself as the Antichrist by renewing or making a peace treaty with Israel for 7 years. We thought, most think it was just a random peace treaty that is just relevant right then. But think about it. It says, what's the actual wording? The covenant. So the Antichrist comes to power by confirming, enforcing, establishing, or renewing the covenant. What covenant? It's the covenant that God made with Abraham is the covenant. And so, again, isn't it ironic that right now in the world there's this thing called the Abraham Accords, the Abraham Covenant, the Abrahamic Covenant, and that is the instrument that is being used to try to bring peace to the region. Now, if someone comes along, now I know what you're thinking. I'm not implying that the one who has invented or brought the Abraham Accords to the public is the one, the he that Daniel's talking about. I'm not saying is it. No one knows. But I'm saying the mindset, the instrument that could be used is out there. And I think somebody from that region that has some standing, has some power, will be the one to take it and run with it and confirm and promise Israel, we will agree to this. And perhaps, and again, probably there'll be somebody that'll say, hey, you know what, let's try this for 7 years and then revisit it. I mean, if you hear the words, if you hear the Abraham Accords and somebody talking about a period of time of 7 years, and you little antennas should just start going up big time. That's the world we're living in right now, folks. We're living in Bible times. We're seeing scriptures that are 2,500, 3,000 years old manifesting in the world where we're at right now, in the very words that are being said and being spoken. And I'm reminded that it says that when they cry peace and safety, when they say peace, peace, sudden destruction will come upon. There will be no peace. Everybody will think we've solved the problem. We brought peace. And as soon as they think it's all figured out, the Bible says sudden destruction will come. It'll all come falling apart upon them. So keep an eye on this when you're watching TV, watching the news. And specifically, it's something else that's been brought forth. If you remember, President Trump talked about this a few days ago, this International Board of Peace. Have you heard that being brought up? Right now, President Trump is the chairman of that committee, that board. He said he didn't really want to be, but he's too busy, but they're asking him to be. So maybe look for him to turn that over to someone else pretty soon. But an International Board of Peace, right now it's him and Tony Blair, who used to be the Prime Minister of Great Britain. We don't know who else, but we're being told that there's all kinds of important people and world leaders that are wanting to be on this International Board of Peace. And I would keep my eye on that, because we know that there is some kind of authority that comes to power. The Bible talks about 10 kings that don't have a kingdom, but they have authority, and at some point in time, they turn their authority over to the Antichrist. And again, this Board of Peace, which isn't a government, it's not a country, it's going to be made up of a bunch of important people in the world, and it really smacks of something that could evolve into what is being talked about by Daniel and by John in the book of Revelation, taking place in the last day. Okay, rabbit trail. We got to get back to Joshua. But again, it's like here we are reading Joshua, and it's leading us to events and things that are taking place right now in the same area with the same people, going by the same Gaza, Palestine, Philistines, Philistia, Abraham Accords, Abrahamic Covenant. I mean, it's like the time is, it's just time has changed. Then you say the names have changed or what? The names haven't even changed. It's like the same names. It's the same stuff going on. It's just the faces have changed that go with those names. All right. Let's look at the bottom of page 38. Mission accomplished, obedience commanded, possessing the promised land, Joshua 23, verses 1 to 5, and I'll read that in my Bible because they don't have all the verses, and I'll read that in the Bible, then Annette read paragraphs 1 and 2. And it says, "And it came to pass a long time after the Lord had given rest unto Israel from all their enemies round about, that Joshua waxed or grew old and stricken in age." It'll happen to the best of us. "And Joshua called for all Israel, and for the elders, and for their heads, and for their judges and their officers, said unto them," stated the obvious, "I am old and stricken in age. And you have seen all that the Lord your God hath done unto all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he that hath fought for you. Behold, I have divided unto you by lot these nations that remain, to be an inheritance for your tribes from Jordan with all the nations that I have cut off, even unto the great sea westward." Again, from Jordan with all the nations that I've cut off, even unto the great sea. From the river to the sea. Again, here we are reading Joshua, and we're hearing the same catchphrase, except God is telling Israel, I have given you the land from the river to the sea. But what do we hear today is on college campuses and at Antifa rallies and all that are rallying for. These people have nothing in common with the Philistines, with the Palestinians, and yet they're coming together to protest and rebel against everything. And amongst them, they're chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. What's that saying? What God said he's giving to the Jews, we're saying we're going to give it to the enemies of God's people. We're going to take it away from God's people and give it to the Palestinians. It's direct rebellion against the word of God and the decree of God. And if you want to trace that back to its origin, who is the one who is the antithesis of the word of God, the one who is the rebel against everything that God has said? It comes straight from the heart of Satan. When they're chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, it may as well come straight from the lips of Satan. Why? Because it's the exact opposite of what God declared, that he was giving the land from the river to the sea to his people, Israel. So, again, pretty interesting. Verse 5, and the Lord your God, he shall expel them from before you and drive them from out of your sight, and you shall possess their land as the Lord your God hath promised unto you. All right, paragraphs 1 and 2.
This passage begins with establishing a time frame. The text says a long time had passed since the Lord had enabled Israel to conquer the land. It probably took about 14 years for the entire period of conquest. After that, there were about 7 years of apportioning the land to the various tribes and their settling in. Thus, about 21 years had passed since Israel entered the Promised Land. Joshua had been born in Egypt and was probably about 40 years old when the wilderness wandering began. That would make him about 80 years old when the conquest began. So he is now over 100 and sensing that his days on earth were ending. We know he was 110 years old when he died. It was time to challenge Israel to reaffirm their commitment to follow God and his covenant. So Joshua called the leaders of the nation to meet with him. This probably occurred at Timnath-Serah, where Joshua lived as his appointed inheritance. Or this meeting may have occurred at Shiloh, where the tabernacle was located and which served as the worship center for Israel.
Okay, just stopping for a second here just to mention biblical Shiloh. So before there was a temple in Jerusalem, the city of Shiloh, which is just west of the Jordan River, it's north of Jerusalem, north of Jericho, in the hills of Judea, which of course is in the middle of the West Bank these days. But biblical Shiloh was where the tabernacle, so you remember the children of Israel built the tabernacle in the wilderness, and in the tabernacle there was the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, and so it was a temple made out, it was a tent temple, if you will. It was a portable temple that they could take apart and move as they moved through the wilderness, and then they could set it up. Well, when they got into the Promised Land, they established the city of Shiloh as the permanent home for the tabernacle, and thus the permanent home for the Ark of the Covenant. And so when they came to worship the Lord on Passover or Pentecost or the Feast of Tabernacles, the children of Israel would come to Shiloh and camp around the tabernacle as they did in the wilderness. And so Shiloh kind of became the unofficial the official spiritual capital of the nation of Israel, the people of Israel in that day. I say that to say actual Shiloh exists to this day, has been uncovered archaeologically, especially in the last, it's been known for quite a while, but the last 10 or 20 years they have really done a work unearthing it, even to the point now that they have found the foundations and the walls of where the tabernacle stood for nearly 400 years in Shiloh. I should have thought, I don't know why, it just dawned on me, it's like, duh, I should have had a picture up. But you can go online, you can, Google whatever, Shiloh, and you can find pictures, images, and you can read articles, but you can actually go, and today it's a tourist area. In fact, the red heifers, you remember the red cows that we've talked about, I don't want to get sidetracked on that, but that's where they're being kept, is at biblical Shiloh. But you can literally go and they can take you, they can show you the outline because it's the exact dimensions, and there's a room, inner room, and it's a rectangle, and it matches all the dimensions in the middle of the city. and the ruins thereof, and this is where the tabernacle stood. And so literally you can go and you can walk into this area, and you can go and stand where the Holy of Holies, you can stand in a spot on a stone where you know without a doubt that the Ark of the Covenant stood for nearly 400 years. And even if you go to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, you can't even be assured exactly where the Holy of Holies was and where the Ark of the Covenant stood with that certainty. You can literally go to Shiloh today and know this is where the Ark of the Covenant stood for 400 years. You can see it with your own eyes. You can touch it, with your own body. And so I just thought that was pretty cool that exists. That testimony, that confirmation of the Word of God is something that's tangible in the world in which we live in. You can see it with your own eyes, that history. So again, when the Palestinians say, oh, the Jews are just colonialists, they're just coming in and trying to take our land, and it's like that when Jesus said the rocks will cry out, literally every rock in Israel cries out, Israel was here. God's people, this is God's land. It belongs to God's people. Okay, read the rest, paragraph 3 through 5, 3, 4, 5.
When the tribal leaders, priests, and judges had gathered, Joshua told them he was a very old man and knew his time as their leader was limited. Other great men remained robust until the time of their deaths, including Moses. But Joshua had led a hard life. He had led many military campaigns for Israel as a senior adult. His life as a warrior, military commander, and spiritual leader had worn him out. Joshua reminds these leaders of their recent history. After conquering most of the people of Canaan, he worked with them to divide the land among the various tribes. This division of the land is described in chapters 13 through 19. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh had elected to receive their inheritance east of the Jordan River. The other 10 and half tribes received their inheritance in the area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan. The descendants of Joseph were so numerous that they received 2 allotments, one from Ephraim and one from Manasseh. The tribe of Levi, being devoted to God and the service of the Lord's house, received no tribal land. Instead, they were apportioned certain cities scattered throughout Israel. Even though the major cities had been conquered, there were still remnants of people living in Canaan to be conquered. One reason the Lord allowed some areas for future conquest was to test the Israelites to see if they would be faithful to his decrees. Another reason was so the land would not become a wilderness filled with wild beasts. However, the Lord promised Israel eventual complete victory over all the Canaanites if they would be obedient.
All right. So this last little portion here, Joshua is recognizing the fact that, and Junior, pull that map back up real quick. Joshua is speaking to the people, and again, this is where they're at. God has given him all the land from the river to the sea, but if you notice, the green areas are the areas not under their control yet, so there's still a lot of work to do. And Joshua is acknowledging the fact that all of the land has not been taken yet, and there's still work to be done. And so what he's saying, however, he's like, but that's okay for right now, because let the Canaanites continue to live there, continue to farm and keep up the land, because it mentions about the wild, at the top of page 40, another reason was so the land would not become a wilderness filled with wild beasts. So Israel didn't have the population yet, they didn't have the resources yet to actually occupy all of that land. And so that was as much as they could handle with the numbers they had. It was going to take some time to have more children and to grow. And so God is saying, you know what, it's fine. Joshua is saying, let the Canaanites stay there for now. Let them keep putting the roofs on the houses, tilling the land, planting seeds, and keeping the wild, killing the wild animals and keeping the area kept up. They're just keeping it. They're taking care of it for you. But the expectation was eventually you are going to conquer all of the land. It will be in due season. And it reminds, when I'm thinking of this, it reminded me of the passage in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22, that basically says the wealth of the wicked is stored up for the righteous. Even now, there may be people out there that are, and I've heard so many instances where a church, has a building project, or they don't know how they're going to have the resources or the money to pay for this new building they need, or to do this outreach or whatever. And there'll be some local businessman who doesn't go to the church, not even a Christian, that will come and write a check for $1 million or something and take care of the bills. And you would think, well, how can God use that? That's not even, church money, or it's not, somebody's not a Christian. But it's like, hey, it all belongs to God. But let that person do all the work, and let that person spend their time sweating and earning that money. And God's like, when it's time, when you need it, I'll get it to you however, from wherever you need. And so that's kind of what he's saying here is, yes, there's still some Canaanites in the land, but that's fine. Let them take care of the land for you. It's still your land, and when you're ready to move in, boom, and I'll be with you, and I'll allow you to have it. Now, going back to verse 1, I was thinking of this. In verse 1, it says, it came to pass a long time after the Lord had given rest unto Israel from all their enemies round about. Now, if you look at that map, had they defeated all of the enemies round about? No. But now this is what it looked like when verse 1 of Joshua 23 is written. And it says, it came to pass after a long time, so we know around 21 years of fighting, the Lord had given them rest from all their enemies round about. How can we say that God gave them rest? Well, looking up that word, I'm not going to break it down like this, but there was, looking up rest in the Strong's Concordance, there was all kinds of words that were used or were translated into English as rest. But in the Hebrew, this particular word that's used here means that things got quiet or they settled down. It was kind of referring to not having constant activity. So there was a lull, let's put it that way. Things had settled down. They weren't quite as hectic as they had been. But there were still enemies round about. And God, as I said, God expected them to eventually conquer the whole land. But you can imagine the scenario when they went into the land. You remember they went in, as soon as they went into the land, they started marching around Jericho. And then they went from Jericho to Ai, and Ai, then the Gibeonites came in and deceived them, but then the Gibeonites were surrounded by their enemies, and they had to go fight the Gibeonites, and the sun stood still, and all that battle's taking place. So for a good 5, 6, 10 years, they're just moving from one battle to the next battle. And the more territory they won, the more they had to likely stop and take care of the land, keep the weeds down, plant. If you kill the people that were farming the land, somebody's got to farm the land. So that meant that now, if they've conquered every bit of purple in there, whenever they conquered it, now they kind of have to leave somebody behind that can't fight the next battle, because they have to take care of that land. And they go and fight the next battle, and now they've got more land. And so as they're doing this, over this period of time, they're just moving from one place to the next. And they kind of got to the point where, okay, we don't have enough people. we can't keep fighting. And so the Bible says, though, too, at this point, basically the other nations around there, knowing that if Israel comes against it, remember those letters to Pharaoh we read last week? All these nations are panicking, and what are we going to do about the Hebrews? What are we going to do? And then at some point, things settled down. The Hebrews stopped progressing, so the Canaanites that were still left just kind of went, okay, I guess we can just go about our business. The Israelites that they'd already conquered this land, they're like, okay, well, let's take care of, build our houses and renovate these houses we've inherited and grow crops. And so there was a time of rest. There was a lull. Things settled down. Now, if we equate this spiritually to a church, because how many knows the book of Joshua, if you haven't, the book of Joshua is really synonymous with how a church operates, how God's people are possessing the land. God's people are going in to the promised land, that what God has called us to do, where God has called us to be. So there's a parallel there. So if we look at this scenario in a church, church growth often comes in spurts. I've talked to some other people about this. I've seen it my whole life. A church typically doesn't grow like that. It grows like this, and then like that. It's in spurts. It's like stair steps. And so there are times in church growth where things are hectic. There's a spurt, an influx of people. There's building programs. There's new ministries that have to be started. And there's all this activity. And with all this activity and an influx of people, there's drama. There's hurt feelings. There's something happening all the time. And then there's a lull. Then there is rest. Now, is there rest because, we've won this whole city, now we can stop and rest? No. Even the largest church, mega church out there hasn't won their whole city yet. They can't rest because there's no one left to win. Are we resting? Is there a lull because there's nothing left to do? No, there's always something to do. Are we resting because there are no battles still to fight, no battles still to come? No. But I believe that God allows the rest, and in the terms of this context of this word, things to calm down for a while, things to settle down. God brings this rest or this time of settling down and periods that you would say are kind of uneventful or even somewhat boring or routine in a merciful way. Because think about it, the children of Israel had to keep fighting to conquer everything at once. They wouldn't even have had the ability to take care of what they had already conquered. And if they had spent 20 some odd years in nonstop battle, I don't care what Wheaties they were eating, they would have they would have just physically been so exhausted. Now, God could supernaturally have given them strength. But see, at this point, some of that kind of supernatural God influence ended when they crossed the Jordan River. Remember, when they were in the wilderness, God kept them shady in the summer and warm in the winter. He had food just fall out of the sky. He kept their clothes from wearing out. God was kind of doing all that. And the Bible says when they crossed the Jordan River and they came into the promised land, it was on that day that the pillar of fire disappeared. The manna stopped falling. And it was basically now, you are going to do things in your own strength physically with my help. Which again, that's how we operate today, isn't it? I would love for a pillar of fire to show up every Sunday. I would love for God to open heaven and just have bread falling into the sanctuary. But we're living in the days of Joshua. We're living in, the church is synonymous with Israel going in possessing the promised land. We have to fight the battles. And so again, God, that same scenario where God will take us as far as he can take us before he knows we're going to wear out. And then he gives us rest. And don't think that the rest means there's nothing to do, we're done, there's no more enemies to conquer, because there are. There's no more lost souls out there to win, but there are. But sometimes we have these periods where we look around and say like, well, there's still so much to do, but we're just kind of at our peak right now. But that God is just resting us up for the next spurt. So I want us to keep that in mind if we come and we have the mindset thinking that, well, things haven't really blown up lately, taken off, and we haven't had this huge influx. Oh, it's coming. It comes in spurts. But it comes when we've been able to take care of what God's already given us. Because if we can't take care of what God's already given us, he's not going to give us any more. There'll be rest until we can take care of and we're ready. And now you have the children in place that now they're looking for a piece of land for themselves. They're looking for new horizons. They're looking for a better day and more territory. And when we're ready for that next step, then that's when the next spurt happens. Does that make sense? Like kind of like labor pains, yeah. We're working towards the birth. We're working towards the ultimate goal, but it doesn't come. If labor pain, sometimes, it depends on the child, depends on the woman. Every pregnancy is different, but sometimes the labor pains last for an hour or two before the delivery, and sometimes they last for a day or two before the delivery. But Lord knows, thankfully in that time there's contractions and then there's a time of rest. There's contractions and then there's a time of rest. If a woman had to go through 2 days of nonstop contractions and nonstop labor pain, they wouldn't survive. But God knows that there's a time of effort, there's a time of labor, and then there needs to be a time of rest and lull. And so that doesn't mean we're done. It just means that God is resting us up. True rest in Scripture is shalom. That is now, when you achieve shalom, that is where you have reached all that God has for you, the peace of God. And it's interesting, too, that in this scenario, look at this map. It wasn't eventually all from the river to the sea, because remember, this map is about 13. Let's just put it around 1360, 1370 BC. It wasn't going to be till David came, established his kingdom, and Solomon, at the end of David's reign into Solomon's, was when all of the land that God said they would possess it all, but it didn't take place until David's reign, again, who is a type and shadow of the Messiah. But that shalom, that total victory, that total peace did not come until after David made Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, which means Yehu Shalom, is what it means, the peace of God. And when David became king, he made Yehu Shalom, the peace of God, he made that the capital of Israel. It was then that he conquered the Philistines, and it was then that all of the land eventually came under the control of the children of Israel, and the kingdom was established under him, that Solomon, then his son, just walked right into. And Solomon inherited the shalom. What was the greatest age in all of Israel history? It was the reign of King Solomon, because they had shalom from all of their enemies, and they possessed everything that God had for them. All right. We have a meeting, and I still have more to go, but what I have left to go will marry perfectly with Samson. And so, if you remember, next week we're going to be in the last lesson on page 64 that's in the book of Judges. It deals with Samson. What I have left in this lesson was going to set the stage for that. So what I'll do is, because of our meeting, I'm going to stop here. Next week, we'll pick up here. We will talk about the things that are going to lead up to Samson, and then we'll get into the Samson lesson next week. So we will end here tonight. So when we come back next week, we'll be on page 40 and spend another half hour or so in this lesson, and then a half hour or so in the Samson lesson. All right. That's where we're at tonight. God bless you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for those joining us online, and for those here, remember to give us about 5 minutes or so, and then we will go into our meeting about our upcoming harvest of blessings. Amen.